I call Stefan Browning.
Kia ora. I'd like to speak to the Animal Welfare Amendment Bill and some of the supplementary order papers. And I would also acknowledge the government's changes in terms of the blunt force, the issues around use of blunt force, the shark finning, as great examples of change. But I'd also note that they came with a lot of public pressure. The government bowed to public pressure. And these are what we see as issues that have risen to public attention. But in the meanwhile, huge cruelty carries on and the government is doing little on some other areas that it could. So I look to the Minister and hope that he and his ministry will drive harder on issues of animal welfare during this very term, during this very year would be a really good start. I realise that in New Zealand we have a major cultural weakness, in fact, around farmed animals and what we can sort of do and what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. But clearly there is a shift, and even this bill shows some of the shift and the issues around sentient beings and so forth. As my colleague said, the monitoring and enforcement will be where this bill and other changes that have happened in recent times will be really measured. The words practical come up in here, and most in the House, apart from I think the Green Party, have talked about practicality or balanced. So the people that say balanced and practical and laugh in the government side, they don't mind the cruelty going on in cages and farrowing crates and other things that are happening in nearly every form of farming. What's balanced about accepting cruelty? There is nothing balanced about it. And we talked about the cheapness of eggs as a protein source, but totally forgot that vegetable protein can be a hang of a lot more cheaply produced and with a lot less environmental effects in terms of a lot of our animal production. In saying that, I'm what I call a selective omnivore. I will eat some meat if it's produced organically or it's wild or something like that that hasn't been brought up in a cage. There is no excuse for carrying on with caged farming. And I have a lot of sympathy for the pork industry. We've got to look at the context that the pork industry is in, because the context of that is an animal or an import health standard that allows 50% almost of the pork consumed in New Zealand to be imported, and we won't have any control over how those pigs are produced. And those disadvantaged pig farmers in New Zealand are competing against pork produced in ways that we are saying we need to phase out. So the Minister, I ask you to look at issues around the import health standard as well. I know it's been traversed right through to a range of courts. But why was that? That was because the Biosecurity Act was not strong enough. All these bills, acts, need to be looked in the context of the others, and we must have some changes so that we get rid of those farrowing crates sooner, but we also help our producers not have to compete with cheap, cruelly imported meat from overseas. In terms of the birds, in terms of the hens, the last time NAWAC did any changes, I think it basically effectively said that the hens could still live in the space of an A4 sheet of paper. They might be in a slightly bigger cage, a few of them, but effectively each had that much space. There is no need for that. And the sooner we change that, the sooner people look at the opportunity, take up the opportunity of genuine free-range systems, and we must move to that. So the context, it's also how the regulations are enforced, how the Minister and his ministry get in there and ensure on that enforcement and monitoring. Mr. Chair.
Stefan Browning.
Thank you. I'd like to speak a little bit too on the alternatives. And my colleague Mojo Mathers talked of what happened with in terms of the psychoactive drugs part, another context. That context there showed that there are real alternatives to these cruel practices. But if we say practical and balanced, too often you say, oh, it's not practical, it's economically there's a disjunct and we can't afford to go down that path. If it was people being involved with the testing, we'd be doing it quick as lightning. We would have no problem with bringing in the alternatives. There's tissue cultures, a whole range of technologies that have been very advanced that can take the place of all these sorts of testings. So there will be more that will need to come. There will be more changes that will need to become and amendments in the future beyond the amendments that are in front of us today. Even the changes, and I'm also grateful to see the government do something around the cosmetics area and do that as a lead in the direction of change that we need. But there in that one, and I really do acknowledge and am grateful for that change in the supplementary order paper there, but the exemptions in there's a real risk that you could drive almost anything through because of the number of different substances that might be included in there. It'll be over to the Minister and the Ministry to be making sure that that's not rorted in some way, that we have real depth to this, that we are leaders in the world and show the way forward around animal welfare. To be said that we are first equal in the world, that might be in terms of the system that we have, but the application of the system, I would suggest, needs a little bit more scrutiny. So thank you, and we'll obviously be supporting this and those, the bulk of the SOPs in front of us. Thank you.
Members, the time has come for me to leave the chair. The House will resume at 7:30 p.m.